So there's a balance to be struck, and I think he does a disservice by not speaking more extensively about where that balance point is.
Yeah, shockingly, I agree with you on this
That's
one.
terrible. I don't know. Okay, podcast over. I don't know.
Yeah. All right,
Oh,
so
that
I got
looks good.
the
Okay.
summary. Yeah, I got the summary
Yeah.
as usual. And before we get into the summary, we sort of both agreed before the podcast started is that this lecture talks about Marcus Aurelius or Stoicism, and then
Yeah.
at the tail end, it starts to talk about Jesus and the idea of agape. And then the lecture after this is just all about agape and Christianity. And we
Yeah.
kind of both felt that we should just leave the whole agape conversation for the next discussion.
Yeah.
So this
Which
discussion
we've
is
done
just
before.
Stoicism.
There was also a previous lecture where, like, okay, it covered two subjects towards the end, and we
Yeah.
just,
And this is
yeah, I
really two
think it's
subjects
better
because
to
the
go.
agape talk is
Correct.
nothing to do with the Stoicism. It was it was just a break. He could have probably spent maybe
Correct.
another 20 minutes on Stoicism, but he just structured it differently. So
Yep.
we are just going to talk about Stoicism and the whole idea of Stoicism in this podcast. So which again he did a very good job at describing. But I'll go ahead and start with the summary.
Yeah.
So the main idea that the Stoics introduced was to encourage us to recognize that there's a difference between an event that occurs in your life and the meaning that is ascribed to the event. The events are just physics. However, to the event, we bring completely independently a meaning to the event. So if somebody said a rude thing to you today, for example, you might ascribe a certain meaning to that rudeness. That meaning might be that the person doesn't like you, or perhaps you yourself are not worthy of being respected. Almost all people, all of the time, mindlessly, automatically, and reactively ascribe meaning to events and and think that the two things are exactly the same thing. What the Stoics wanted us to do was to recognize that events are just events, or physics, and the meaning we bring to them are separate things. So why does this practice of separating meaning and event increase wisdom or help us live better? And it does so because we seldom have control of events, but we do have a lot of control over the meaning that we ascribe to the events. If we immediately assign a meaning to an event, we become prisoners to that external circumstance. If the external circumstance is some amazing thing like money, fame, or power, it is ever easier to connect the meaning to the event. We are rich, famous, and powerful because we deserve to be. In fact, it becomes a deep part of our identity. I am a person who is rich, powerful, and famous. That is who I am. That is the meaning of my life, and that is my identity. But all physics tends towards entropy. And eventually, your money, fame, and power will go away. And if they don't go away in your own lifetime, they will go away in your death. And because we have connected all these things so intimately to ourselves, the circumstance and the meaning, once we die, we will lose in some deep way, we will lose ourselves. The Stoics then argue that that we fear death because we fear fatality. That is, we fear that the entropy of physics will unwind the circumstances that we have tied our identity and personhood to. Because when we die, the meaning and the circumstances unravel once and for all. Conversely, if the event or circumstance is a bad thing, if it's not money, fame, or power, for example, we seek to remedy our situation by trying to control the event, a happenstance that might not be controllable, and therefore we lose some degree of agency. In circumstances where we have much advantage, like Marcus Aurelius did, as well as in negative circumstances, the path to wisdom lies in divorcing the event from the meaning, to know that they're not the same. So the Stoics advocated practices called by some spiritual practices to help us internalize this perspective. One of them was objective seeing, which is to see events as mere physics, to cast it in such a light so that we get used to seeing it just as physics and not as the meaning that we ascribe to it. So that cup that you've been using for your morning coffee for 10 years is not some special cup. It's just a vessel made of some matter that holds a liquid that you drink in the morning. They also practiced another thing called the view from above, which is the practice of extending your perspective so that you see yourself as the small and insignificant thing that you are, which helps remind you that the circumstances and meaning that you've attached to them are really no significant thing in the grand scheme of things. Another extension of the practice of separating meaning from event is the practice of premeditatio, which is the contemplation of how things might go wrong or be taken away from you. Vervaeke doesn't really elaborate this a whole lot, but it would be a practice of visualizing something bad happening, like the death of a loved one, the onset of sickness, or some financial misfortune, and being emotionally prepared for it. And conversely, grateful that it isn't already here, and perhaps a greater awareness of needing to prepare for such contingencies. He finally also makes a great point about internalizing Socrates as a way of prizing apart the meaning from the event. So say you fall down and you break your leg, and you quickly conclude that your life is ruined and everything is horrible. This is where Socrates would step in and challenge your judgments about the event. So because we're prone to mindlessly, automatically, and reactively making judgments, our understanding is far behind the meaning that we've ascribed. And this self-critical questioning of our conclusions in a Socratic way can help untangle the two things. And so that's my summary in its totality.
Fair enough. Yeah, man. I told you before that we started. This one is the first time I really have significant disagreements.
Great.
You know,
Happy to hear them.
Yeah. And one of the things I do want to caveat is I do feel like he gave lip service to the claim that I'm or the objection that I'm making, right? So you can point to certain points in the lecture and be like, no, see, he said, right? But he said it like once and yet continued to emphasize this issue that I'm about to bring up. And that is, just as we've been talking about the notion of the having mode and the being mode, right? There's a lip service to the having mode. He says, yes, you need the having mode, and then quickly moves on to talking about the being mode. And there's a validity to that because in some ways, that is the one that has more often been struggled with. That's the greater cause. However, there's a bit of damage, I think, that gets done because when you only emphasize the being mode, it comes off inevitably as if that is the more important one in a global sense, not that it's more important to talk about at this moment because it's mostly what people have forgotten, right? And so similarly here, I would say that yes, it is important to prize apart the meaning from the event to a degree, right? But representing them as completely separate is false, right? And you can give obvious examples of this, right? Your wife cheats on you, right? And the Stoic is like, well, why are you assigning this meaning to this event, right? Let's address the meaning that you've assigned, right? And so the thing here is, similarly, I actually think that, and this is why I have more objection here, is I think that, as he noted, Stoicism is kind of a lot of the basis of modern therapy. A lot of therapeutic ideas have entered the public consciousness. And I think that what people are missing is the balance between the having mode and the being mode, or more precisely, the balance between manipulation of internal meaning assignment and manipulation of the external. And in fact, a lot of what I talk about with my patients is you have more control than you are admitting to of external events. You could quit your job. You could move. You could live in another city. Now there would be a cost to be paid, but those things are doable, right? And the example I give, you and I both know, we had a friend in residency who really did not do well in residency and in fact attempted to commit suicide. Now, when she quit residency, moved away, lived with family, got a job outside of medicine, is very happy. She's married, doing well. She was not well suited to the demands of medicine, right? She was a phenomenal physician, but she took everything to heart. All the pain, all the suffering that we come across. She just had that very empathetic response, which made her a phenomenal physician, but also made it untenable for her to continue, right? She was drowning in the suffering of the patients. And so it has always struck me that the solution was not internal, it was external. The solution was, it was not a failing on her part. It was, hey, you are not well suited to this circumstance. Similarly, if some, if I may be more emotionally evocative, some woman is like, being beaten by her husband, the solution is not, well, let's talk about the meaning you're assigning to this, right? Because there are options, that especially in this country, right?
Yeah.
So I think it is correct. You need to have wisdom does constitute, and I agree with this statement that he made, having a clear understanding of what is in your control and what is not. I would nuance that a little bit by also saying understanding the timeline under which things are under your control, because maybe I have to make arrangements for my kids before I leave my abusive husband. Maybe I have to do, so maybe I can't leave this second, right? But I can plan an escape, right? And so that is under your control. The external circumstance is under your control, but it may not be under your momentary control. There are limits to your control, right? That's different than denying the control. And I think we do see that a lot in our culture. That's the victim mentality that you and I both sort of decry is, well, I'm not white, so I'm oppressed and nothing I can do can ever, right? And so all I can do is learn to accept the meaning of this. I can't change it. I can't do anything, right? So I would push back against his notion that the primary diagnosis is that we underappreciate our control. I would actually say, at least in the modern era as I perceive it, we make both errors. Is we underappreciate our control and we overappreciate our control, right? And he only talks about overappreciating our control. And so that flaw, I think, then permeates all the rest of the lecture to where I'm like, no, actually, you also need to think about what you can do to change your circumstance. My business is not doing as well financially right now as I'd like. Okay, well, should I just lay back and be like, well, why am I not grateful that it's not doing worse? I could, right? I could spend all my time focusing on gratitude or I can spend that time trying to grow the business, right? Now, here's the where it really gets nuanced for me is, in order for me to spend that time on the business, to some degree, I must experience the dissatisfaction of it not being where I want it to be, right? And so in that regard, I think a lot of, and this is a broad statement now, so maybe I'll make the statement, then I'll let you respond. One of my big complaints with a lot of how Buddhism, Stoicism, all these things are kind of addressed, at least popularly, and I think he does this in this lecture as well, is, well, the pain we experience is the gap between what we want and what we have, or the gap between the experience we want, even if that's an experience of meaningfulness, and what we have, right? And one of the ways to adjust that is to want less, to be content with less, to focus on gratitude for what you have. And that's true to a degree, but it also would leave you, if taken to its logical conclusion, in stasis, right? You would not actually make progress. You would not pursue the goals, because if you mastered this idea, you would not go anywhere, right? So there's a balance to be struck, and I think he does a disservice by not speaking more extensively about where that balance point is.
Yeah, shockingly, I agree with you on this
That's
one.
terrible. I don't know. Okay, podcast over. I don't know. Agreement between the two of us? What are we going to do?
Yeah, I know.
This is not...
I totally agree, and I think you've also stated it correctly. Is that our malaise? The more common malaise is, and let's be clear, the Stoic philosophy is geared towards people who are proactively trying to better themselves, right? So the person who just is like, oh well, I'm just a victim, it's
Yeah.
not going to land for them anyway, right? It's like, you have some person who doesn't believe in exercise, smoking and doing crack cocaine and like eating pizzas all the time. And you sit down and talk to them about the benefits of, saturated fats versus unsaturated fats. That lecture is like beyond them, right? That's not what they need to be hearing,
Sure.
right? They need, so this is, so perhaps one way to think about this is that this is for someone who is already motivated to engage with the world and are sort of seeking to reframe their cognitive processes when they attain that engagement, right?
So, are you familiar with the psychological experience of derealization?
Is that depersonalization?
Depersonal. That's an aspect of it, right?
No,
But well,
it's kind of
derealization is just what it sounds. It is the perception that the world is not real. You walk around just sort of as you engage in the world, you have the sense that you're in a movie or that something that you are not real. The world is not real, right? Um, and I think that some of that, some of the prevalence of that, which is happening among Gen Z especially, comes from this sort of therapy, stoic, world from above viewpoint. Is no, at some point you have to be engaged with your life. Like at some point you need to be the first person in the story and say, yeah, you know what? Like I'm the main character of this story and I want to, in a Thoreau sense, I want to suck all the marrow out of life, right? And the good and the bad, right? And there's suffering involved in that. And there are periods of meaninglessness and there are periods of sadness and depression and emptiness and whatever. But I am going to engage with life deeply for all the good and bad and not try to blunt or use therapy or stoicism as an opiate to or meditation to lull my feelings of dissatisfaction. I'm going to embrace also the notion that a fully lived life will contain deep periods of pain. Deep, Gibran has this. This is one of the reasons I love Gibran more. And some says, the deeper that pain carves into your being, the more joy you can contain, right? And this notion that these things are fundamentally linked. You can't skip the down and get the good, right? And so you got to bite. You got to decide how big of a bite of the apple you want to take. But the apple's the apple, right? And life is life, and so.
Yeah, I agree. Again, I mean, the way that I look at it is that it's probably Stoicism itself, like I just said, is probably geared towards people who have already decided to engage with the world, right, and are seeking to optimize, right, and it
Well,
can
I guess.
be. So
Sorry.
there's a parallel here also
Yeah.
between we talked about Buddhism, and the meditation of breaking the frame and then reframing as well, right? Like scaling down attention and then scaling up attention,
Yes.
and
Yep.
that both are
Very
important,
correct.
right? And so when an
Yep.
event happens, right, and we scale down, we sort of just let the information, the physics, sort of like wash over us. But at some point in time, and we talked about this as well, we have to reframe also, right? We've got to like
Yes.
put the frame back together and then
Yes.
move forward in the world. And we talked about this in the podcast where we talked about this particular lecture,
Yep.
is that there must be there's a whole like universe of wisdom involved in the breaking of the frame and then the reframe. Is like,
Yes.
how do you then reframe correctly? Which frames do you decide to engage with when
And
you decide to reframe, right?
and the psychotechnologies of engagement and this is maybe let's get back to this. Actually, I'll throw this out there, let you ponder it as I'm talking about other things. To me, I did come recently think about the idea that the reframing, the re-engagement process, to some degree, is closer to the notion of entering flow, right? Whereas meditation is kind of a different thing. Anyway. I'll let you chew on that. What I was getting at, I wanted to clarify originally about the notion of derealization. These people are very motivated because they are suffering from the sense of unreality. They are trying. They are working very hard. The problem is they are given therapy. They are given more of it's like they've broken the frame, and then they're told to meditate and break the frame further, right? Because they're not given the therapy of saying, look, what you need to do is go do things that will engage you. Learn to be engaged. Learn to be fascinated by things, right? Find things that maybe used to captivate you, and just even though they won't, engage with it. practice it, right? And we've got half the practices, the meditation and the Stoic sort of like view from above, because maybe that was maybe the issue before therapy became quite so widespread, right? Of people being super over-engaged and over-controlling and neurotic. But now I think we've got people who want to re-engage but aren't given the psychotechnologies of re-engagement.
I think there's still a whole lot of people who are just sort of neurotic, right? I think
Totally.
media,
That also still exists. I'm not saying that doesn't exist. Sorry, I'm saying it's closer to a 50-50 split than I think he gives credit for. Maybe it's not truly 50-50, but it's not 99-1.
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to settle this debate about what is the split. My impression is that the split is, heavily weighted towards people who are just like running all over the place and, quickly sort of like latch onto a meaning, and they never think about separating it at all. But I take your point, though. I do myself think that there should have been more emphasis about. I mean, so this actually speaks to something that Epictetus said, right, in his handbook, right? Is that the first sentence or the first like point that he made is the core of wisdom is to recognize what is in your control and what is not in your control.
Absolutely.
But here's the thing: the things that are within your control, be careful about how you're bucketing those things. I mean, that's the core of wisdom, is to categorize those things correctly, right? And if you just think everything is out of your control, well, you haven't categorized anything, right? So you are, in a sense, not being stoic if you just like categorize everything as not in your control, and all you have to do is just focus on your attitude, right? Which is not what Epictetus is even saying. But I do take your point is,
sure,
even Vervaeke and all of my own readings about Stoicism in modern interpretations have completely emphasized the breaking frame more than the reframe, right?
And working with patients, this is an insight I've gotten working with patients who are trying to reframe, right? The notion of control is way trickier than you might think. And here's how. Is the example I've given is juggling, right? Is if you want to learn to juggle, okay, you can juggle 1, you can juggle 2, you can juggle 3 maybe. Learn to juggle 5 balls, right? Is it in your control or not? Well, kind of. I mean, it is. It's a learnable skill. But not right now. Not at this moment. All you can do right now is fail, right? And so that's an interesting notion of control, because it's like, well, you have to get 10 exact things right almost at a subconscious level before this juggling happens, right? So all you can do is kind of like keep failing at it long enough for your brain to try to pick it up, right? And so that's a weird version of control, in that like it's not what we think of like, oh, I control moving the cup or, whatever. But it is under your control, but it's over a longer time period. It's an absorption. It's a re-engagement with the juggling. It's I'm going to keep doing this somewhat stubbornly until it works.
Yeah. So it could not, I mean, the notion of control also then stretches across time, right? It's temporal as well. Like I don't have control now, but maybe I will have later. So if I don't have control now, should I just give up entirely and just reframe, or should I just keep
and the issue
until I do?
The reason I chose juggling in particular as an example is it becomes oddly binary, right? In the sense that like you're gonna fail like 0 0 0 0 0 0 success, and then 1, right? And so and then the ones will, and then you go back to 0, right? And then you'll get 1, and it'll seem like luck, or it'll seem like just chance. Oh, I just got it that day. I don't know why, right? And it's just a matter of you just got to keep doing it. Just got to keep doing it.
I totally agree with you. I think that there's an overemphasis on thinking that everything is not under control, and that can be very dangerous. But then again, like, the original Stoics were the ones who said that it is about knowing how to categorize each properly, right? And I think Vervaeke, in some other episode as well, had said that, the core of wisdom is discernment, is to know.
No, it's in this one too.
Yeah. Oh, it's in this one
totally.
as well. So, and that's like, that's a really fundamental thing, right? And
totally.
The reason that this has been internalized in me in the last few months is, I think I had, almost subconsciously this notion that wisdom was about the right beliefs. Right? That if I just had the right perspective and it just settled, right? Oh, sure. Now I have it. I have wisdom.
Yeah.
It, right?
Totally.
Whereas really, it's a practice in some
Yes.
real degree, right? You could, for example,
Yes.
turn all of, your attention, your intellect, your, life experience to a problem to try to discern the right course of action. And you bring to bear all of your wisdom, knowledge, every, aspect of your identity you have to the problem, and you could still fail. But then maybe 5 years later, that version of you doesn't fail, right? So you have somehow increased your wisdom quotient, right? And this was like a weird, like in retrospect, it seems so obvious, right? But it's a subtle thing. There's a subtlety to it as well.
It's
And it might be because of my Muslim background, right? I think like, I grew up in a
sure.
very orthodox Muslim environment where like this is what you should believe.
Yeah, yeah,
And if you memorize the Quran, then you are like going to go to heaven, and that's like the highest good you
Sure.
can attain. And if you do these sort of procedural things and you internalize these propositions, then you have arrived, right?
Yep.
And it's probably taken me a lifetime to break that way of thinking, and
What's
think
really
that
interesting?
It's an iterative process.
What's really interesting is the degree to which that experience of Islam is actually informed by Protestant Christianity in the modern world, right? Because you look back to the sort of the golden age of Islam, it was very different, right? And if you look back at if you look at how Islam's practiced even in Malaysia, right, which isn't as Arabized, which isn't as westernized, because with Martin Luther and I mean Christianity had this to some degree from the beginning, but especially starting with Martin Luther, the notion that belief was the thing, belief is and then reinforced by the Western sort of rationalist, humanist sort of scientific method, is that what matters is your belief, right? But original Christianity wasn't that way, actually, by all reports, and even Eastern Orthodox Christianity is not that way, right? Eastern Orthodox Christianity is much more like Islam in some sense, right? Or right, and then the degree to which our mutual experience of Islam in the modern world is much more belief focused than I think in other parts of the world or in other ways, right? And so,
So in that sense, wisdom is a destination; it's not a process, right? Which is a very self-defeating kind of perspective.
Yeah. Well, and you and I argued about this even on the podcast when we talk about Buddha, right? Is that we talk about achieving enlightenment, not engaging in enlightenment, right? And that's, but it probably should be the other. And exactly the issue I had, I framed it as I was thinking about this lecture is well, it's a bit of a problem if Buddha didn't go back and rejoin with his wife and son, because his meaning enlightenment allowed him to pass over his moral reprehensibility, right? And so then it's just a spiritual bypass. You got the feeling of feeling good, so you're like, well, fuck my responsibilities, right? And so you have more respect for Marcus Aurelius in that sense, because it's well, okay, he wanted to keep his responsibilities and still engage in this process of finding enlightenment and trying to figure that out, right? And so,
although I wouldn't use the word enlightenment is a very different kind of thing, right? I mean, it's almost described as a mystical experience, right? As not so much a road of wisdomhood, right? I don't know that these are the same universes necessarily of cognitive activities. Enlightenment is somewhat different, I think. Anyway, on that note of
but okay, yeah.
Well, on that note of
we can skip over it.
On that note of discernment, one of the things that I think I told you a few weeks ago that I started doing is I came up with a ChatGPT prompt, telling it to assume the role of a Stoic wisdom, master, and help me, in a Socratic way to examine my own perceptions about things, right? And I've been using this for some time, and I'm going to go in and tell you a little bit of a story about a difficulty that I had that very much speaks to what we just talked about, right? So as you know, I recently started working at a new hospital. It's a part-time gig, so I'll be coming and going. And my first day was absolutely it was a giant catastrophe, right? And the main reason I was such was because I was very poorly prepared on the medical record system that they had, despite the fact that I very proactively wrote to them multiple times saying, listen, this is a new system for me. I've never used it before. I just want to let you know that I want to make sure I'm adequately trained. if you have materials for me to study, send them in advance. I'll do them on my own time, right? If you have videos, I'll do it on my own time. And I telegraphed that like very loud and clearly multiple times, and nothing, of course, happened. And then I actually, went a day before to do orientation, which was a proactive thing I did. They didn't actually ask me to come, but I did it. And they didn't tell me where to show up. There was like no orientation at all. And then my training was like 90 minutes of like, well, this is how you turn it on, and this is what, and so when I was actually taking care of patients, I felt very overwhelmed because the system is like not well designed to begin with, and I wasn't familiar, and it's very easy to make mistakes, and I almost did make some major mistakes on a patient, and it was just like a giant, like very stressful day. And what it triggered in me again were a lot of these resentments that both of us have towards like the healthcare industry in general, which is like, well, people are not thoughtful anymore. They don't really seem to care. This is just now a business. There's no like kind of professionalism anymore, and all of these things, right? And that experience triggered me a lot, right? And I was like seriously thinking of just like quitting. I'm like, I found myself in yet another environment where people are not, attentive, and they're not like, oriented to, making sure that patients are safe and things are done well. And then the second day when I woke up, I didn't even sleep that well. I was so upset that I fired up the ChatGPT prompt, and I tried to work through my emotions. It was like 5 a.m. because I couldn't sleep. And, it asked me in a Stoic manner, the question that it asked me is are the elements of this job that you're working in within your control or not? Right? That's what it asks me in a Socratic way, because that's what I, prompted it to ask me. And that triggered, in me a thought. I'm like, well, I don't know if it's in my control or not, right? And I actually told ChatGPT, it's like, that's the crux of the problem in these sort of situations is I don't know if it is in my control or if it's not, right? If you're engaging with a monolithic system and you don't like parts of the system, you're not entirely sure to what extent you can change things or you can change things. Maybe if you make a lot of noise, things will change, right? And so I kind of sat with that without much resolution for a few hours, and then I went to work, and I was just like roiling up inside, really debating just to like quit, just tell them I'm not coming like next week and cancel all my shifts, find somebody else. And then a thought occurred to me is that, okay, the thing that's triggering me here is the impression that I have, and this is like very apropos to this conversation we're having about Stoicism. The thing that's triggering me is the impression I have that the people I'm working with don't care. Like they don't care about whether, patients are well taken care of, or the system is working well, or like, they're being attentive to important details. And I don't want to work with these kind of people if that's who they are, right? And so I question that impression, in a Stoic manner. It's like, okay, this is an event that happened. The meaning was that they don't care, right? Now, should I question that? To what extent should I pull that apart? So I pulled them apart for a second, right? And I said, okay, this is the impression that I have. How can I investigate that impression further? And then I came up with a plan. I'm like, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the CMO of the hospital, and I'm going to call the head doctor, the guy who recruited me. And I say, listen, I need a meeting. and I called him in the meeting. I closed the door. And I said, listen, I really like your hospital, and I like working here.
Took him to the
I
mattresses.
would like to.
Yes, sir.
And I said, and I was very diplomatic. I was. Here's the thing. I was calm, because I had made up my mind. Like, I'm going to say some things to you or to them, and if it wasn't taken well, I was looking for signal. I was looking to see if my impressions were valid or not valid, right? And I thought, the best way to do that is to tell them that I was very disappointed with how things were done, and I feel like they should have done better. And I told them that I want you to hear me, and I want to know if things are going to be different, right? And so I basically just let it loose. I was polite. I was not rude at all. I was very calm. And I was looking for signal, and I decided before the meeting that if I get the signal that they don't care, then I'm just going to not come back. And I made up my mind that quitting is 100% the potential outcome of this meeting. And I unloaded on them, and then it was like they apologized. They're like, oh, we definitely have to do things better. Like, this is a very new process to us, and blah, 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 blah. And I felt very validated, and they even thanked me, like, it's the only way we can improve is when people like you tell us like things are not
Yeah,
going
yeah, yeah.
well, because we've all been working here for so long. We haven't recruited a new doctor for a long time. And
Hmm.
after that was done, like the 5 minutes later, the head hospitalist is like, hey, please make sure you come back, right? Almost in a conciliatory way.
Sure.
And so that was like a good example of like, okay, I had ascribed a meaning, right? And
Hmm.
then I figured out an experiment to challenge the meaning and see if that meaning was valid or not. I looked for further validation and I didn't find it, and the rest
Hmm.
of the time I was like much calmer. I'm like, okay, these people they actually just made an honest mistake. This is a new process for them onboarding a new doctor, right? And it's forgivable. And it seems like they really like heard me, and and we had a better relationship. Now they know that,
Hmm.
okay, like if something doesn't work, I'm going to like speak up, right? I'm not going to just
Sure.
passively take it, and they themselves will try to be better. So I feel like that's where the breakthrough came with like, okay, I had to make a discernment,
Yes.
and it took like time. I had to think about it, right? I really struggled with like, how do I figure this out? And like I just sort of, I said, okay, this is how I'm going to do it, right? And it had to come with a posture of like, okay, I'm ready to walk out the door if my initial meaning that I prescribed to the event is validated or not. But it turned out not to be, right?
Hmm.
So I thought that was
So
like a very good application
it
of these
is.
principles that I've been learning.
It absolutely is, and that's actually so I'll piggyback on that to raise this from where you took it, which is discernment, to the absurdity of where I think some of these things go. Right, is to say, well, why didn't you just realize that you're ascribing this meaning to something that isn't in your control, right? And what you need to work on is breaking the cup, right? Letting the cup break and learning to be okay with a shitty healthcare system, right? And part of the answer to that is that's not who I want to be. I don't want to be a person who's okay with
Mm,
not caring about patient care. I want to suffer in that environment. If I am in an environment where people do not care about the patients, I want to suffer. I want to be pissed off, angry, and not okay. That is who I want to be, right?
mm,
And that's, it's an important distinction, right? Because it's like, okay, well, then me being upset itself has purpose. It has meaning for me to experience these negative emotions. It's not that every negative emotion is a trigger for me to rethink the meaning I'm ascribing. I may be assigning exactly the correct meaning,
right,
right?
right.
And so, I mean, the classic, you can take that, people always talk about like, there's even memes on YouTube and stuff or TikTok with like, if somebody's like, oh, you broke your promise to me and that made me upset. It's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I can't control your emotions. You control your emotions, right? I can't make you feel anything. Why don't you take some responsibility, right? And the answer to that is actually, I have taken responsibility. I don't want to be the kind of person who is not upset when someone lies and breaks a promise.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
That's
Right.
well said. I think maybe the additional element to add to this sort of algorithm, right? Like event happens, you ascribe meaning, divorce meaning from event, and then examine the meaning and ask
Yes.
yourself if that was the correct interpretation, right?
Yes.
And then
Yes.
maybe come up with a test, like, okay, how do I stress
That's
test the
yes.
meaning, right?
Yes. And that's why
That
it's
might be the
important to
correct
be able to
model.
pull them apart.
Yeah, yeah,
And
exactly.
look, but you may
Right.
absolutely just be like, nope, I had it right. That's
Yeah.
that's
Right.
that's
And then you have a decision to be made. Are you
yeah.
okay in that environment or not? Or are you okay
Yeah.
with that, meaning or meaning and event or not, right? Yeah, I know that's actually a profound, I think, insight, and it's something that's not talked about often enough.
Yes. That's my
I think just talking out this example with you, and just like I mean, you can't believe how much turmoil I was in yesterday, right? Because I was
No,
so much,
yeah, I can
was
yeah.
so looking forward to working in this place. It's a smaller hospital, like we're talking about, and it's and I'm one of the only doctors on the floor, right? And so like I wanted, and that we talked about, how you can recover meaning in the healthcare system, and I have found that I get it from teaching, and I also get it from working in a small hospital where like my presence really matters. If I decide to be a complete shithead and a narcissist, then that just like depresses everybody. But the conversely, if I'm like like Marcus Aurelius, positive and happy, or just like a light in the darkness, the metaphor that we sometimes use together,
Yeah.
then that lifts everybody up also, right? Because I'm the only guy doing it, right? I'm the head
Yep.
hospitalist doing it as well. Uh, we can talk a little bit more about that if you had any further thoughts, but I did want to change the flow and ask you another question as well.
Well, I actually did have a. Maybe I'll just share a personal story to some degree. Through residency, which I had a really hard time with, in on a personal level, I actually was fine with the medicine. I was fine with the hours. I was fine with whatever, but various personal things made residency very challenging for me. And through that time period, I really came to identify with and appreciate Dr. House, the character, right? And part of that is, well, when you're in a situation that's broken, you can glorify your brokenness. You can glorify a broken response to a broken situation. And then I graduated and was still kind of captivated by that idea. And certainly I share certain characteristics with him in terms of personality and this and that. But I really consciously had to choose a different role model. And I remember conscientiously going back through older books to Dune and Wizard of Earthsea in particular. Ged is the main character. And it was a bit hard, honestly, to let go of idealizing a broken character and choosing a character who didn't have a dramatic, wholeness is boring. If you're just whole and happy and kind of like whatever, there's no drama to that role, right? That you've achieved a certain like whatever, and the way this is related to what we were talking about is the question in my mind. I remember thinking was, stop considering what you want to do, stop considering, how you want to feel, and start considering who you want to be. And instead of thinking about what feelings you want, think about who you want to be. What do you want to be upset by? And something I still have that's kind of Dr. House is, that you and I share, is I'm okay if like the healthcare system's annoying and bureaucratic and whatever, but if it gets in my way of actually providing a patient with care and somebody is being, then I'm pissed. And I'm not okay with like don't get in my way. Like in terms of like, okay, I have hoops to jump through, there's clicks and this and that. That's annoying and I don't like it. And it's stupid. But when it reaches the point where I now cannot deliver the care that I should deliver to a patient, that's where I go off the rails, right? But that's where I want to go off the rails. Like that's, if we all have a stupid example, which most people won't even get, but one of the things drives me crazy is admissions for SBP, spontaneous bacterial peritonitis, for ascites with liver disease, and nobody does a paracentesis. They just start antibiotics and they say, oh, IR will do the tap in the morning,
day,
right? Morning's like for oh, it's Friday, they'll do they'll do it on Monday, right? Like, well, you missed the diagnosis.
Because that's the schedule.
Right?
That's the OR schedule.
That's the OR schedule, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I very much have gotten in the habit. I grab a 60cc syringe and an 18 gauge IV, and I do. I just pull. I don't do a full paracentesis all the time if they don't have all the equipment. But you can just put a needle in the belly and suck off some fluid and move on, right? It doesn't even take that much, right? And that's why I'm so irritated. Is we are doing the wrong thing for the patient, and the ER doctor should be doing that before they start antibiotics, right? It shouldn't be down to me to do it after they've even hung the first bag. But even that's better than waiting till Monday morning with, with the IR. But everybody does it. Like all my colleagues just, I don't know, you just, whatever. And I'm like, it's a simple, like needle, syringe, enter, pull, done. Like,
the best way to perhaps think about like how to Well, Stoicism is that it's a psychotechnology, right? Not necessarily a life
Hmm.
philosophy, right?
Yeah,
So that
sure.
if it's a life philosophy, then this is how you always think, right? But just like meditation as well, right? I mean, until Vervaeke explained the scaling down, scaling
Yes.
up, I meditated, for years before that. It was very spotty. There would be times I'd meditate a lot, then I wouldn't do it for a year or two, and then I'd come back to it. But, I don't call myself an empirical atheist, deterministic atheist anymore. But when I was, then I did it because, oh, I can concentrate better and I can, like, my blood pressure is a little bit lower now, or my cortisol or whatever, like, bullshit, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah,
but
yeah.
now I'm like, oh, I am doing it because I can deploy the psychotechnology when I go out into the world in very meaningful ways, right?
Yep.
They, for example, like something pisses me off, and I would otherwise get triggered. Now when I'm meditating, I can sort of like create some distance, right, and have some agency about choosing whether or not it's appropriate to be angry in this instance or not, right? And in a similar way, Stoicism also like allows for that as well. So in just to like piggyback on your example, you should choose the things to that you're going to be outraged about carefully.
Yes.
That's perhaps another way of putting it,
Yes.
right? So that if your
And
coffee cup breaks down and then you're outraged, well, you're
right.
overreacting, right? But if a
Correct.
patient is not being managed properly because the healthcare system is broken, be outraged then. Then the meaning and event
Yep.
are conjoined and it's perfectly appropriate, right? So
Yep.
it's the discernment, right? Is like you separate them and you decide whether the
And there's
outrage is
an element
warranted or
of
not.
choice there, right? Yeah, there's an element of choice in the sense of like, well, first of all, choosing who you want to be. Do you want to be the kind of person who's pissed off by that? Right?
Correct.
Maybe you don't. Whatever. I do, but maybe somebody doesn't, right? And so that's an element of choice. And then there's the layer of like, and this is an odd experience I think for most people, is when you could calm down and you choose not to, right? Because you're like, oh, actually, I have the psychotechnology to calm myself down, chill out, take it in stride, but I'm not going to. I'm going to scream about this because this is fucking
Well,
bullshit, right?
I'm
And so
unlike you. I mean,
it's an
I
interesting,
whenever I know you glorify anger to some degree, but
I love it.
when I am angry, I think I get and I'm actually acting angry to other people. I think I go off the rails very fast and I say things I don't mean. And so almost always when I do things out of anger, I am not my best self. I'm not presenting like the most coherent like argument back, right? So a case in point in this particular case with this hospital, when I sat them down in the meeting, I wasn't really angry. Okay, I was a bit irritable, right? And because the triggering emotions were coming up again, but I really was not like, oh, like banging on anything. I was like eloquently explaining why these guys had failed me, right? And I think that was actually powerful. Like, oh, if this person can calmly tell us, right, in highly with a very cogent argument in a way that is non-confrontational, then there must be some truth to it. Right now, if he's just yelling and screaming and spitting, as he's yelling and screaming, then they may perhaps themselves not separate the meaning from the event. All they'll be
Of
seeing is
course.
some angry doctor who's having like low blood sugar or something, right? Or he's just like angry for some other
Well,
reason, right?
and
But
you
if
know this about me.
my presentation on the other hand is calm and cool and collected, then it's very difficult for them to like have a meaning that is not the one that I intended, which is just a honest feedback of like their processes, right? So
Yeah.
my approach is choose your outrage, but then enact it with cold, calculated calmness. Because I just think that's just more effective, right? As
So
opposed to
I
yelling
think
and
that
screaming.
is often more effective 90% of the time. But
Right. Okay.
but there is that 10% where the most effective thing is to break chairs, right? And Taleb talks about this, right? Is that like
That's where
what
discernment
part of
comes
the
in. To know when to
Yeah,
break
no,
the
exactly right. No, exactly right. And actually Taleb makes this point too, is that like there's actually value in 5% of the time breaking chairs, even if you just pick it at random, right? Just so that people know that you can break chairs, right? And that also creates a certain environment of like 99% of the time this guy's totally chill. But do I really want to push him because I may catch the 1%, right? Whereas if there's never that 1%, people will push you and push you and push you because there's never a consequence. You're going to calmly and coldly, rationally explain what they've done wrong and whatever, and they get away with murder. You know what I mean? And so there is actually value to having that, like, every once in a while, you know, I'm going to go apeshit. And so, yeah, there is the limit, right? And so people, at the very least, it makes manipulative or malicious people think twice because they're like, okay, I don't know that I want to deal with that.
You're saying that if you were Marcus Aurelius, every now and then you would raise a village to the ground.
100%. 100%. Absolutely. 100%. That's just to make an example. Just to show that I can, right? That's
that you would.
Yeah. That I would.
If you're
exactly right.
If
the
pressed. The circumstances warranted.
Otherwise, how will they know how generous I'm being?
Right. That's
right. The rest of the time, right? They may perceive that as weakness or incapacity, right?
So
better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war, right?
Another threat that I wanted to explore a little bit was another idea that he didn't deeply dive into, which is the fruit of Marcus Aurelius's spiritual exercises, which is the meditations book, right, that everyone reads, right? So I am really taken by the idea of spiritual exercises, right? So Marcus Aurelius was writing these things, right, as a form of spiritual exercises. I don't, you could think about the view from above as a spiritual exercise versus a psychotechnology. I don't know that it seems like a spiritual exercise. It just seems like a perspective shift as opposed to anything else. But I was wondering, like if we were just to move on a little bit from the topic of Stoicism and think a little bit about what it means to have a spiritual exercise in a secular world, right? Perhaps, Stoic sort of writings to yourself could be a spiritual exercise. The thing that, I have... and I don't do this as a sort of deliberative practice, although I've often thought that I should, is a gratitude journaling or a gratitude contemplation, right? Like, what are you grateful for, right? That I think does strike me as a good spiritual exercise. And again, now we're being a little bit from Vervaeke, but his use of the term spiritual exercise in a secular context is intriguing, right? And I think he kind of I don't know if he's going to come back to it later in the series, but it's an intriguing concept that I think, I think we should explore further. Is there any, did that resonate with you in any way? Do you yourself think that there's some value in so-called spiritual exercise? And if so, what would they be for you?
Yeah, actually, so this gets back to where we started in my perspective. The notion of a spiritual exercise, I think, to me, is reframing. It is the enactment of a new frame, right? It is practice at a new frame, right? And so I think that's kind of the notion, is that once you've broken the frame, maybe it depends on how you're defining spiritual exercise, because maybe you could include meditation as a spiritual exercise, and then we start to blur the terms or view from above or whatever, right? For me, how I conceive of spiritual exercise is those practices that enact the being that you want to move towards, right? And so you do that in a conscientious, small way, right? So that in bigger ways you are better trained, right? So even the ones about the Stoicism, okay, breaking the cup or whatever, right? It's this notion that and the way I learned it from my dad, actually, and something my mom was always moved by in some sense. She wrecked the car one day, and I was a kid or whatever, and she always tells the story is that when she called my dad, they were a young couple at the time, right? And it's like she was worried, he's going to be so upset. My dad's a car guy, so he's always been into cars and so on and so forth, and this and that. And the first thing he said, "Are you okay?" Right? The rest we can fix, right? And he immediately had that perspective. Right? And she was struck by it because it wasn't what she was expecting. She, whatever, this and that. And my dad can be pretty negative at times and can be very focused on errors that you've made and this and that. So she wasn't set up for that expectation, right? But immediately that was his response. It's like, if you're safe, you're okay, The rest is just stuff. And that was the language I learned, is it's just stuff. And stuff is just stuff. It's not people, right? And that distinguishment I grew up with, and I very much internalized that practice. And I do practice it intentionally. Is like, when my favorite coffee cup breaks, it's annoying, but it's just stuff, right? Like, it's not real in some sense. It's just stuff. And so those are spiritual, small, tiny, stupid example, but those are spiritual practices, I think, of okay, in this small way, when it's a coffee cup, practice being the person that you want to be, right? And now, where I disagree with some of the stuff he talks about is like, do you really want to be a person that's like totally cool when their child dies? Like, probably not. It's probably not somebody you want to be, right? So I don't know that that's super useful. I think in the way he described it, I think it can be useful to be aware of it, to say, hey, my parents are going to die, my child might die, and let me not take it for granted, right? Let me
I think
be awake
that's
to
really
it.
the core of it. I don't think, again, it's like if your child dies,
well,
a Stoic would be okay with it.
Well, but he did say to be emotionally prepared, and I think that's the falsehood, right? I think that I don't think is possible. I think that's a lie.
I think emotionally prepared in the sense that you're not surprised, right? That, oh my God, I never thought this could happen, right? I never thought my wife would cheat on me. It just like I thought that was an impossibility, right? Or I never thought so-and-so would die.
Okay.
Right?
But I still don't think you'd be emotionally prepared. I think yes, you should be aware of the possibility. I agree with that, and not surprised in the I never thought this could happen kind of way. You should be surprised that it did happen, because it's like, well, no, like on a probabilistic scale, I hadn't ranked that super highly, right?
Right.
And so it's violated my sense of probability, right? But yeah, you shouldn't have a zero probability assigned to any of those things, right? Like, you should have some, okay, it is possible that anyone could die. It's possible that anyone could cheat. And, any friend can betray you theoretically. It shouldn't be a 0% chance. It should be a 0.00001% chance, right? And even that makes a difference in terms of awareness. The reason I'm harping on this a bit is...
By the way, betrayal is the hardest one of those to really assign a zero probability to, right? Because, like, part of trusting someone is thinking that they'll never betray you, right? And if you have some like element of like, well, they could betray me, then you don't actually trust them, right? It's almost like it's a counter.
I disagree with that.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Again, it's very much what I said before, is I am choosing to be surprised if this person stabs me in the back, because I don't want to live a life as a person who's constantly watching my own back all the time. Right? That would be an awful life. I would not be an awful person. And that's not who I want to be. That's not how I want my relationships to be. And so I'm accepting the risk that this person will betray me. And willingly accepting that risk. I'm willingly putting myself in a situation where I will be devastated if this person betrays me. Right? And I accept and I validate the choice of that devastation. Because my life would be emptier without it.
Yeah. Sense.
And so
I'm taken
but being
by
aware
the idea,
nonetheless, it could happen.
By the idea, your definition of a spiritual exercise is that engaging in practices that help you to become the person you want to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think like people listening might take that in two ways. I mean, and maybe you had your way of like taking that, but one interpretation could be the person you want to be is some sort of like station in life or some series of accomplishments. The way that I took it as well. Because that's like the Western hustle culture is like, be everything you can be, and that means like be the CEO of this company, or like
right.
the rich or famous or like in great shape, right? But the way that I'm taking it now is the person you want to be, meaning the principles that you want to embody, perhaps is the best way of describing that, right? Because like we said, we talked about this before as well, is if you decide to enact certain principles, right? Let's just say the principle of you're not going to lie anymore, right? That's a principle. you're never going to tell an untruth again. Then, and you move forward in life doing that. And Vervaeke talks about this as well. Like the agent arena coupling then can change, right? Because you are making, you're as an agent, you are co-identifying with the arena, but then the world is also responding back to you, and then opening up, new horizons. He's talking about the selective constraints and dynamical systems theory, right? So if you
Yep.
have a selective constraint put on yourself, you allow then yourself to grow in different directions because of that constraint, right? And
Mm-hmm.
as a result of that, and Jordan Peterson talks about this as well, life is just an adventure because you don't know where that's going to take you. And you don't
Yeah,
know what
totally.
you would become
Yeah,
necessarily, right? And it's not so much
sure.
the destination of who you're going to become that matters, but it's the
Yes.
adherence to your principles that matters the most, right?
Yes.
And so,
I think
whatever
that's
practices you engage in that allow you to continue to stick to your principles would be a spiritual exercise in my book.
I think that's powerful. I think that's certainly a true framing. I'll just talk this out. It just popped up in my head, and it's something that I do emotionally resonate with. I don't know how much philosophic validity it has, to be honest. I think you've nailed the philosophic validity, so maybe I'm just riffing more emotionally. But the notion of worthiness, in some sense, as well, is like if you became rich, right? Like, or you became whatever. There's a notion that, like, okay, do I feel like this is the kind of person that I want to be rich? Like, I want this person to be revered in society. I want this person to be held up as a standard. Again, it's a reflection of what my principles are, right? Who do I want to have power and fame and whatever? Well, I want people who are paragons of virtue to have power and fame. Like, you know what I mean? And the fact that our society doesn't necessarily reward that. Now our society to some degree does reward hard work. So like there's some degree of that, right? It rewards innovation, right? And so there are aspects of our society where these things function, but then it's also like, well, the Kardashians have fame, and I'm like, okay, no, I don't really validate that that's who I want to have fame and power, right? Um, I don't know. I just again speak maybe more emotionally. There's a scene in a movie where this young girl is praying, and she says, it's very early in the movie. She says, "Dear God, I am wrapped in a robe of light, clothed in your glory that spreads its wings over my soul. May I be worthy." And there's an interesting notion there that, like, if you were blessed with everything, would you feel worthy of it? Have you lived a life? If God's blessings came upon you, have you lived a life where you would feel you were worthy of those blessings in some sense? And that's an interesting notion, I think, that for me emotionally validates this notion of principle. That, like, I don't know, if you got to heaven and God let you in, would you feel like that was the right, like, not would you feel like you got away with something, or would you feel like you were worthy of it? And to live a life where at the end you felt like, yeah, you know what, like, I was worthy of that. I don't know. Again, I think you nailed it more intellectually in your statement. I'm just speaking more emotionally.
Yeah. I mean, being worthy, I mean, so to enter heaven, so to speak, right? To be, clothed in God's blessings, so to speak, is perhaps, an aspiration, right? As opposed to a destination, right? It's aspiration is, no, sorry, not aspiration. I meant an ideal, as
Yeah.
opposed to an actual destination that you think you're actually going to get to.
No, of course. Yeah.
Your North Star that guides you, as opposed
Yep.
to thinking that you actually will be worthy, right? Perhaps the better question, to ask yourself is, at the end of every day, if you were worthy, in the sense
Sure.
that did you conduct yourself and comport yourself in such a manner that if you did this every day, then you could look back at the end of your life and say, well, that was a worthy life, right?
Mm-hmm.
As
So
opposed to, doing the view from above, so to speak, right? You're thinking about it as a destination far in the future, whereas really, and we talked about this before, right? every day is a constant prayer in that sense, right? In that you are
Yes.
trying your very best,
That's great.
right, to
Yeah.
enact the principles that you feel you should be enacting, right?
Yes.
And like those moments come all the time, right? And it comes to like, am I going to the gym, or am I, like rushing forward to meet the day? Was I kind today when kindness was required? Did I stand my ground when that was required, right? So and so, and there's all these many things, right? Multiple times in the day. Then in that sense, I feel sometimes very blessed, right? That I'm still a physician. I say still because I quit, some time ago, and then came back.
Yeah.
Because it is one of those things where you do have the opportunity multiple times, to practice compassion when needed, to push back when needed, to be a team leader when needed. There's multiple opportunities where those sort of spiritual practices can actually be embodied moment to moment, multiple times a day, right?
Yep.
We've talked about it as well. Like, the ideal would be for your workplace to be the theater of your spiritual practice, right? And some professions lend themselves to that more than others. And medicine definitely has that potential of, lending itself to a theater of spiritual practice, right? More so than others, right?
I don't know why you limit it to the workplace. I guess, I mean, your life should be the theater of that practice, right? I mean, home life,
Yeah,
the
sure.
way you treat your family,
No,
the way you treat your friends.
That's true.
Like,
I'm not
all
limiting
of
it
that matters
necessarily. Yeah.
No,
But
no,
it's an
yeah,
important part of,
it's-
But you're right.
it
I mean,
is.
it's everything.
It is.
It's like, how you talk to the janitor, right? Or how you
Yeah.
talk to some random stranger, right?
And
how
you
treat your
talked
neighbor.
about talking to the janitor. Yeah, I mean, again, spiritual practice in some sense, right? I do try to take time to think about all the people it takes to make a hospital run. We don't even see them as physicians, right? They're down in the bowels of the kitchen. I don't know if you've been to a hospital kitchen. It's a rough place. Like, it's not like that's
Well,
it's not
just to be clear,
it's-
for everyone listening, the janitors in the hospitals do not work in the kitchen. Those are the
No,
cooks.
yes. Yes, fair enough. No, but yeah, I mean the janitors, the cooks, the people, moving lab supplies up and down, the people, drawing blood in the morning, the people, all these people, some of whom we have contact with, but a lot of whom, as physicians, we don't, right? But without them, those, if the patient's room doesn't get cleaned in between patients, you're not putting a new one in there, right? And so, I mean, it matters. And so, I don't know. It's an interesting notion that, like, yeah, when you say hi to the janitor on the elevator or whatever, it's like, okay, take a moment to realize this person's job makes mine possible, right? Like, and so it's a perspective. And again, I don't always do it, obviously, but like I try to like say hi, remembering that this person makes my job possible, right?
Right. That's a spiritual practice too, right?
Sure. Yeah. Exactly.
Right. Seeing those people.
And so looping a little bit, and I love these kinds of books and that kind of thing. But I was talking about Ged and Wizard of Earthsea and the sequel Tombs of Aton. And Ursula K. Le Guin's a very spiritual writer, right? So a lot of these themes you will find in her writings. Something that I reread recently and felt validated to some degree. I feel like I've grown towards this from where I was when I graduated residency. There's a scene where he's a wizard or whatever, and he's been trapped in an underground tomb, and he's run out of water, and he's sort of like thirsty and dying of thirst and whatever. And there's a young girl who could let him out, but doesn't know him, doesn't trust him. She's very mistrustful. She's been raised to be very cynical, very bitter, and kind of hopeless in a lot of ways. And so she's sort of jeering at him and sarcastic about his suffering, right, in that moment, right? And she's, oh, if you're such a great wizard, show me something. Like, show me something worth seeing, right? And he says, okay. And nothing happens, right? And she's like jeering at him more. She's like, what, you can't even do anything? And she looks down, and she is, instead of the rag she's been wearing, she's clothed in a gorgeous gown, right? And he says, you asked me to show you something worth seeing. I show you yourself, right?
Oh, nice.
And even as he is dying of thirst, he's trying to heal this girl's bitterness about, hey, you could look upward, right? And that's an interesting notion, right? That like, even as I'm suffering, you're mocking me as I'm suffering, right? What I want to show you is what you could aim at, right?
Yeah.
And I think even in these lectures, we're like talking to people about what they could aim at, what they could think about, what, hey, like things are not as out of your control in some sense, right? Like this sense of meaningless you're experiencing is not unsolvable. It's complicated. I'm not going to say it's not complicated. And difficult. I'm not going to say it's not difficult. But it is solvable, right? There is some set of things that could be done to address this, and figuring out what that is, engaging with it, can be difficult. I don't know. I think those things are moving to me, obviously, tearing up in the middle, expressing it. But like that notion of helping others to find meaning and to find hope, very much what I'm hoping this podcast does for people.
Yeah, I think even Peterson sort of, he tears up as well when he sort of thinks about this as well.
Sure.
There's an idea that Peterson had as well about when he was talking about, like, Soviet Russia, like the reason that that was a living hell is because everybody was lying all the time, right? Everyone was not like principled and truthful. And, he didn't exactly say this, but it occurred to me that if there are enough people in society that are lying, deceitful, not living up to principles, not like, trying to lift other people up, basically just sort of like sucking the lightness as opposed to like emitting the light, the society in general then reach some sort of critical mass where then all the lights are eventually snuffed out as well, right? Or the people of character just find it just more, all the more difficult to, contain their character and not get infected themselves by nihilism or by the darkness. And conversely, if there's, on the other hand, a critical mass of, lights, in society, people with character, right, who, because that spreads, right? Like the optimism is contagious and pessimism is contagious, right? And if you can spread that, right, do you have some critical mass of people, like you could think of society as, just sort of this, lights are going out, right? We're just more and more people are losing hope. We're seeing disease. This hospital that I'm working at, by the way, has this really amazing program where it is trying to, treat a lot of people with addiction issues, right? And in the last few days, I've actually
that's awesome.
talked to people with, severe alcohol abuse, addiction issues, and fentanyl abuse issues. One person was like 22 years old, the other was 26 years old, and then there was another who was 76. And because it's not, the census is not that particularly busy, I actually would sit down. I'm like, tell me, like, like about your situation, and the person who's running this program is like this deeply spiritual person, and we really connected on this. We're talking about spirituality, and like, she herself is saying this job is deeply meaningful, right? Because she follows him as an outpatient, and she's saying, you won't believe some of the success stories we've had because people have just sort of like hit rock bottom and then they sort of bounce back up, right? And so she is an example of one of the lights in this sense, right? Where, because she, helps people come out, and then the people who come out then help others, and then it spreads that way, right? So Peterson talks about this as well as, be better, not just for yourself then, right? Because your light will then, illuminate others, and it will light more lights, and that keeps spreading. And that's basically the basis of a good society, where everyone is trying to do their best, right? Trying to be their best selves. A lot of problems just resolve, that you don't have to like pass a million laws, right? How do we make sure that guy is not like, being exploitative, right? Let's pass a law to fix that, right? And then before you know it, like we're just a nation of like, a bazillion laws because everyone's just trying to like outdo the other person in treachery and deception.
I like that too, for a couple different reasons. One is, yes, you will experience more meaningfulness, right? But it's like juggling. It's not quite clear when you're going to experience that, Like you start these spiritual practices and you start doing these things and acting in these ways, eventually that sense of meaningfulness will click. But I can't tell you when. I can't tell you when you'll be able to juggle, right? And in many ways, it can be very binary. Sometimes it clicks in and you're like, wow, yeah, I really feel engaged and like my life is meaningful and things are going, maybe not even well, but at least I'm deeply involved. I'm deeply fulfilled by the struggle that I'm undergoing. But when that will happen, I can't tell you, right? And if you're looking for the feeling, often you won't get it. If you're looking to be a light in the darkness for its own sake, for the sake of others, for the sake of saying, hey, the world would be better if I am this way, even if I never get to experience that meaningfulness that I want, right? That's actually a more likely path to get there, right? And it's an odd sort of catch-22 sort of paradox of the thing is that, like, not that you shouldn't chase that sense of meaning, but if you fixate on it too much, you'll end up acting in ways that are not going to get you there.
Yeah. That might be a good note to end on.
Sure.
Good positive note.
Totally.
Good talk as always.